The great hall of the station was a place built to impress with towering walls lined with banners of 100 worlds and a polished floor that mirrored the light. From the glass ceiling above, Daniel stood among the human delegation, his uniform crisp and his mind alert, for this was not an ordinary meeting. It was the first formal contact between humanity and the royal house of the Syrian Empire, a civilization far older and far larger than Earth could imagine. Their fleet alone could have blotted out the stars if they wished, and yet here they were inviting a handful of humans into their ceremonial chamber. He'd heard stories about the princess long before he stepped onto the station. Whispers carried by traders and diplomats told of a royal figure whose face no one had ever seen in public. She was said to be the most guarded member of the royal bloodline, never appearing without her ceremonial armor and helmet. Some claimed she wore it for protection, others said it was a sacred tradition tied to her people's beliefs. Whatever the truth was, the mystery only deepened the curiosity. Daniel felt the tension in the air. Human delegations stood in a neat line with their leader in the center behind them. The soft hum of translation devices filled the silence. In front of them, the alien envoys waited. Their armor was sleek and elegant, a deep bronze color that caught the light and gave off an otherworldly glow. Each stood perfectly still as though carved from living stone. Their eyes, however, moved with quick precision, scanning every gesture, every shift in posture. The doors at the far end of the hall opened with a deep echoing sound that rolled through the space. All eyes turned to see the figure walking in the princess. Her steps were graceful but deliberate, flanked on both sides by her honor guards. She was smaller than most of the armored warriors, yet her presence was far greater than any of them. Her helmet was a work of art, the surface curved like a teardrop polished to a mirror, shine with intricate designs etched into the sides. Lines of faint blue light ran through the patterns, giving the impression that the helmet itself was alive. She walked with a measured pace, the sound of her boots soft against the floor. Daniel's eyes were fixed on her, though he could not explain why. Something about the way she carried herself seemed almost human, not in form, but in the subtle energy of her movement. He realized his hands were clasped a little too tightly behind his back, and forced himself to relax. The leader of the human delegation stepped forward, offering a formal greeting. His voice was strong and steady, carried clearly through the hall, thanks to the station's acoustics. The princess did not reply with words at first. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, a gesture Daniel could not interpret. The alien guards shifted their stance ever so slightly, the faintest creak of armor filling the quiet. The princess finally spoke, her voice calm and melodic, though muffled slightly by the helmet. It was a language Daniel did not understand, but the translator at his ear caught up, quickly delivering the meaning in his own tongue. Greetings to the people of Earth. We welcome you to the Syrian Hall of Accord. May your journey here be a step toward understanding. There was a moment where the hall seemed to breathe again, the tension easing just enough for people to exchange faint smiles. The conversation moved forward in careful, formal exchanges, each side probing for common ground. The princess stood still for most of it, her helmeted gaze turning from speaker to speaker, never lingering too long. Daniel noticed that she seemed to be listening intently, even when others spoke about trade routes or diplomatic protocol topics that often drew glazed eyes from board officials. Air in the hall carried a faint metallic scent, one Daniel associated with ships and stations, yet there was also something else, something floral and fresh that seemed to drift in from the princess's direction. He tried not to focus on it, but the scent pulled at some memory he could not place. Then came the moment that changed the room. A soft chime rang from somewhere high above, followed by a brief flicker of the lights. The shadows deepened for just a breath before the brightness returned. Daniel heard a low murmur from the alien guards, but the princess raised a hand and they stilled. She took a step forward out of the perfect line of her delegation and toward the humans. It was a breach of the usual ceremonial distance, but no one stopped her. Daniel found himself holding his breath as she drew closer. Her movements were smooth yet deliberate, her gaze fixed on. The human delegation then stopped on him. He could feel the weight of that attention like a physical thing. His pulse quickened, though he kept his posture firm. She spoke again, though this time her voice was softer, almost personal. The translator hesitated a fraction before delivering the words. "Your kind carries a light I have not seen before." It was not a diplomatic statement. It was something else entirely. Daniel could not decide if she meant it as a compliment or a warning. He barely had time to consider before she lifted her hands to the sides of her helmet. The motion was slow, deliberate, as if each step of the process carried meaning. The alien guards exchanged glances, but none moved to stop her. The hall grew utterly silent. Even the translator seemed to hush. Daniel's thoughts raced. Why would she do this now in the middle of the first meeting between their people? Surely such an act would break some rule, some ancient code. Yet she continued, her hands pressing on hidden clasps. The faint hum of the helmet's internal systems dimmed and then stopped. He felt the moment stretch almost beyond measure, the air itself thick with anticipation. Around him the human delegation shifted their stance, not out of fear, but out of pure uncertainty. Even the alien envoys seemed caught between protest and awe. The helmet began to lift, and Daniel saw the first glimmer of what lay beneath. Helmet rose slowly, revealing the curve of her chin, pale, yet luminous, as though it caught and held the light around her. Daniel could not look away, each second pulling him deeper into the strange gravity of the moment. The hall felt wider and quieter, as if the walls themselves leaned in to witness the unveiling. Her guards remained still, but their eyes flickered between one another, measuring the risk of what she was doing, and perhaps weighing the consequences. The visor passed the line of her lips, and Daniel caught the faintest hint of a smile, or perhaps it was the shadow playing tricks on him. Her mouth was shaped with a softness that was rare, even among human features, and her breath was calm, controlled, as though she had done this 100 times before. And yet something in the air told him this was the first time in the presence of humans. The lights from the ceiling shifted slightly, sending ripples of gold and silver across her skin, making her appear as if carved from living starlight. Gasps came from the human delegation, though muffled quickly in respect. Daniel's own breath felt heavy in his chest. He had not realized how tightly his body was wound until the pressure of the moment eased slightly with every inch of the helmet's ascent. He thought of the countless portraits and holograms he had seen of alien leaders, most of them carved or painted in ways that hid true expression and masked real emotion. But here, before him, was something different entirely. Her eyes came into view, and they held him fast, twin orbs of deep amber ringed with faint threads of light that seemed to shift like molten metal in slow motion. They were not human eyes yet. There was a familiarity in them that struck him with a force he could not name. They seemed to see through the polished surface of his uniform, past the formality of his posture, and straight into the part of him that lay beyond training or duty. The helmet was lowered fully into her hands, revealing her hair, which flowed in a cascade of silver strands that shimmered like liquid. Under the station lights, the strands moved with the air, as though each carried its own light. A faint warmth reached him, though she stood several steps away, and with it came that same floral scent from before, now stronger and more vivid than ever. It was unlike anything he had known, not the sharp fragrance of artificial perfumes, but something alive, as if the scent had been grown in a field. Beneath a foreign sun, Daniel's whisper slipped out before he could stop it. Gorgeous. The word hung in the air, and though he spoke it softly, it reached her ears. She turned her gaze to him fully, and for an instant, the world seemed stripped of all others. The tension in her expression shifted just enough to suggest amusement, or perhaps a gentle acknowledgement. She did not look away. Instead, she took another step forward, closing the ceremonial distance until she stood closer to him than to any other in the delegation. The humans behind him kept still, their leader glancing between the two, but saying nothing. The alien guards shifted slightly, but their hands did not reach for their weapons. It was as though they too were caught in the weight of what was happening. Daniel realized that by their traditions, this act might be dangerous. A signal of personal choice over political formality, and yet she continued to bridge the space between them. Voice came again, softer now, without the faint distortion the helmet had caused. It carried a melody in its tone, a rhythm that could not be imitated by machines or translators. The words reached him after the translator whispered in his ear, "I wish to see your eyes and for you to see mine. No mask between us, no shadow between worlds." Daniel felt the meaning more than he understood it. This was no simple greeting, it was a step beyond the bounds of their first meeting, a personal gesture in the middle of an event designed to be purely diplomatic. He searched for a response but found none that felt worthy of the moment, so he remained silent, letting his gaze meet hers fully. A faint sound echoed from the far side of the hall, drawing his attention for a heartbeat. Several alien officials stood whispering sharply to each other, their postures tense. One of them took a half-step forward, as if to speak, but a single look from the princess halted him. Her authority was clear, not through raised voice or force, but through the unshakable calm in her stance. Daniel noticed something in her eyes, then a flicker of recognition that made his skin prickle. It was as though she had seen him before, not here, not in this hall, but somewhere beyond memory. Her next words came without waiting for him to speak. "I know you from my dreams." The translator's voice was quiet, yet the words struck him like a pulse of light. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with a curiosity that seemed untouched by fear or caution. The human delegation shifted again, though not in alarm. They were aware that something personal was unfolding, and though they could not guess its depth, they sensed its importance. Daniel's mind raced with questions. Had she truly seen him in dreams, or was this a poetic turn of speech meant to disarm and intrigue him? He thought of his own nights in recent months where strange visions had pulled him from sleep, images of a figure standing against a horizon of stars reaching out to him. He had dismissed them as stress or imagination, but now the memory returned with startling clarity. The princes drew closer until the space between them was no more than a few steps. He could see the delicate patterns in her skin, faint, as if painted by the hand of light itself. Her silver hair shifted with the faint current from the station's ventilation. Her presence was not overwhelming in force yet. It pressed against him with the weight of inevitability, as though this meeting had been set in motion long before either of them walked into the hall behind them. The conversation between delegations carried on at a slower pace, the formalities continuing but without the same rigid energy. The center of gravity in the room had shifted. The moment between Daniel and the princess had become the quiet axis upon which everything else now turned. He wondered what the next breath would bring, whether she would speak again, or whether the guards would move to separate them. But for now neither happened, and the silence between them was not empty but alive with possibility. Daniel could not pull his gaze away. Her face was unlike anything he had imagined, and yet it carried a strange familiarity that reached deep into his thoughts. Her skin seemed to hold a faint glow, as though lit from within, each shift of her expression catching the light in ways that made her seem alive beyond the rules of the physical world. Her eyes held his with such calm strength that he felt as if the noise of the hall, the weight of the mission, and the presence of hundreds of watching eyes had all faded away, leaving only the two of them in a space carved out of time. There was beauty in the symmetry of her features, but it was not the cold perfection of a crafted image. It was alive and shifting with the smallest changes in her breath and the gentle tilt of her head. Her mouth curved slightly in a smile that carried no mockery or politics, only a quiet acknowledgement that they saw each other as they truly were, without the layers of titles, uniforms, or traditions. She seemed both fragile and unshakable, the kind of presence that could stand against storms without raising a voice. Daniel was aware that others in the hall were speaking now, some in hushed urgency, some in tones edged with concern. The alien officials were not pleased. Their posture spoke of rules broken, of ancient customs ignored, and yet none dared to step between the princess and the human standing before her. She had removed her helmet not for them, but for him, and that act alone had shifted the balance of the room. The human delegation understood the weight of this even if they could not yet see the full shape of its meaning. Princess's gaze softened as she spoke again, her words coming directly to him, though the translator still whispered them in his ear. I wish to see the one who walks in my dreams, and I wished for him to see me in truth. Daniel felt a shiver pass through him, for it was not a claim made lightly, nor did it feel like an attempt to charm or manipulate. It felt as though she had reached into the threads of his life and pulled free a piece that had always been there, yet hidden from his sight. He thought of nights when he had woken suddenly with the image of a figure standing on a horizon of stars, reaching toward him, her face always shadowed by light. He had dismissed it as imagination, a trick of an overtired mind, but now here she was standing only steps away, and that shadow had lifted. The feeling was overwhelming, not with fear, but with an almost painful clarity that he was not standing in this hall by accident. He was meant to be here, and she was meant to meet him. Silver hair moved gently in the air, currents its strands catching the light like molten threads of moonlight. The floral scent that clung to her was stronger, now not overpowering, but steady like the memory of a place he had never visited, yet knew in his bones. She stepped closer, and he could see the fine patterns in her skin markings, so faint they could have been mistaken for the play of shadows, yet, as he looked more closely, he realized they shimmered in slow waves, almost like the tide. These markings told a story, though he could not yet read it around. Then the guards stood immobile, but their eyes betrayed the tension in their minds. They knew the risk of such a gesture, and they knew how the council might react. Still none moved against her. The human leader shifted his stance, glancing toward Daniel with a question in his eyes, but he said nothing, perhaps trusting Daniel's judgment or simply unwilling to disrupt the fragile balance of the moment. The princess lifted her hand slowly, as if testing the air between them, before letting her fingers brush lightly against the fabric of his sleeve. The contact was barely there, yet it sent a jolt through him that was not entirely physical. It felt like the echo of something that had happened before, perhaps in another time or another life. She did not pull her hand away immediately. Instead, she let it rest there for a breath longer than courtesy required, as though she was confirming something for herself. I thought you were only a vision, she said softly, her voice carrying in the quiet space between them. And now you stand here, and the stars are smaller than this moment. Daniel could not answer right away. His throat felt dry, and his thoughts refused to arrange themselves into the formal and measured words expected in diplomatic exchange. Instead, he spoke with the plain honesty of someone who had no time to hide the truth. I thought you could not be real. She smiled again, and for the first time there was a trace of mischief in her eyes, a spark that cut through the heavy stillness of the hall. Perhaps we are both mistaken, she replied, and then her attention flicked briefly to the alien officials who had begun to shift impatiently. Their murmured arguments grew louder, but she ignored them, turning her focus back to him. Human delegation was beginning to understand that this meeting was no longer just about trade agreements or political alliances. Something deeper had stepped into its center, and though they could not yet see where it would lead, they recognized that the connection forming between these two individuals might hold the power to change the course of negotiations entirely. Daniel could feel that weight pressing against him, but instead of fear it brought a strange calm, as though some part of him had been waiting for this exact moment his entire life. Princess tilted her head slightly, her gaze searching his face as if committing it to memory. The markings on her skin shifted again in that slow wave of light, and for a heartbeat, he thought they pulsed in time with his own heartbeat. She stepped back just slightly, but her presence did not lessen. Her voice was calm, yet carried a finality that made it feel like the closing of a door. I will speak with you again, before this day. And she turned away, then her hair sweeping behind her like a trail of silver fire, and walked back toward her place among the alien delegation. The helmet remained in her hands, not returned to its place over her face. Daniel watched her go, aware that every movement she made was watched and measured by the crowd, but also aware that something invisible now linked. Then the rest of the chamber seemed to come back into focus around him. The voices of translators resumed their steady hum, the shuffle of feet, the low rustle of fabric as officials adjusted their robes. All the ordinary details returned, yet none of them felt quite real compared to the moment that had just passed. Daniel knew that nothing about this meeting would proceed as it had been planned. The balance had shifted, and though no one could yet see its shape, its presence was undeniable. Meeting continued, but its rhythm had changed. The official words spoken between delegations seemed almost mechanical now, as if everyone present knew that the true exchange had already begun elsewhere. The human leader delivered his prepared statements, and the alien council members responded with polite precision. Yet the focus in the room shifted constantly back toward Daniel and the princess, even when they were not looking directly at each other. There was an invisible thread that kept drawing their attention across the space. When the formal speeches paused for a short recess, the delegates began to step away in small groups. Some clustered near the food tables, others moved toward the wide windows to look out at the drifting ships beyond. The princess, however, remained standing at her place for a moment, before signaling to one of her guards. Daniel noticed the way she spoke without words, a simple tilt of her head, and the guard moved aside, creating a narrow path between them. It was not an open invitation, yet it was clear who it was for Daniel. Crossed the floor at a steady pace, aware of the eyes that followed him. The murmur of conversations dipped as he approached her. She had not replaced her helmet, and the silver of her hair caught the soft light from the high ceiling. Her gaze found his instantly, as though she had been waiting for him since the moment she had turned away earlier. They stood close enough now that he could see the faint rise and fall of her breath, the way the markings on her skin shifted with a slow living glow. The translator device at his ear was still active, but she spoke quietly enough that its voice felt almost like an echo of hers. "I told you I would speak with you again," she said. "I do not break my word." Daniel nodded, uncertain what form this conversation would take, and unsure how much could be said under so many watching eyes. Yet her tone carried a certainty that made him believe the words that followed would matter. She asked him how long he had been part of his people's diplomatic fleet. He told her it had been nearly 4 years, though his path to this role had been unexpected. He had not sought to be a negotiator, yet one mission had led to another, until here he was standing before her. She listened without interruption, her eyes never leaving his face. Then she spoke of her own position, how it had been given to her not simply by bloodline but by choice of the council, a choice that carried both privilege and burden. She told him of the isolation her role demanded, how tradition had kept her face hidden from all but a handful of her people since childhood. Daniel understood then why removing her helmet had been an act of more than simple curiosity. It had been a statement against the boundaries placed upon her. Their voices stayed low and measured, not because they wished to hide their words, but because the quiet allowed them to speak without the weight of formality. She asked if he believed that their peoples could ever live as allies, not just in the language of treaties, but in truth. He answered honestly that he did believe it, though such a future would be difficult and dangerous. He could not promise her peace, but he could promise the will to work for her. Eyes softened at his answer, and she stepped slightly closer, as if to make the space between them smaller. Her hand rose again, but this time she did not touch his sleeve. Instead, she hovered her fingers just above his wrist, and asked if he had ever felt as though something beyond logic guided his steps. He hesitated only briefly before admitting that he had, that in recent months he had felt as though he was walking toward something unseen. Her expression told him this was the answer she had expected. "I have walked toward you for longer than I can measure," she said quietly, "and now that you are here, I will not pretend it is by chance." Daniel's chest tightened at her words, for he felt the truth in them. He did not know what it meant or what shape it would take, but the idea that this meeting had been written in some way beyond their control filled him with a strange mix of hope and fear around them. The Guards kept their places, but the alien officials were watching more closely now. Their expressions betrayed unease, and Daniel sensed that some would not approve of this closeness between a human envoy and their princess. Still, she made no move. To step back, she asked him what he saw when he looked at her, and though the question caught him off guard, he answered without thinking. "I see someone who could change everything." The faintest smile touched her lips, and she told him that change was exactly what frightened her council. They feared not war, but transformation, the kind that could not be reversed once it began. "That is why they keep walls high and faces hidden," she said. "It is not to keep others out, but to keep themselves from being altered by what they might find." Daniel understood the weight of her words and the risk she took by speaking them to him. A change in her could be seen as a change in her people, and such a thing might threaten those who clung to the old order. Yet, in her voice there was no regret, only resolve. She told him that sometimes a single connection could carry more strength than fleets or armies, that in the space between two people, entire worlds could shift. The recess was nearly over, and the delegates were beginning to return to their places. Still, she did not dismiss him. Instead, she leaned closer, just enough that her words would not carry beyond him. "I will ask you something before this day ends, and when I do, I will trust your answer without doubt." Daniel gave a short nod, knowing that whatever she intended to ask would not be a simple question. She stepped back then, and the moment broke as her guards moved to close the space around her. He returned to the human delegation, feeling the weight of many eyes upon him. His leader gave him a questioning glance, but said nothing. The talks resumed, the sound of formal voices filling the hall once more. Yet Daniel's mind was fixed on her words, and the unspoken question that lingered between them. He knew that before the day ended, she would find a way to ask it, and he would have to decide in that moment whether to step forward into something that could alter the course of both their peoples, or to step back and let the chance pass. The final hours of the day passed beneath the careful structure of diplomacy. Speeches were exchanged, agreements drafted, words chosen with the precision of a blade. Daniel played his part as expected, offering input when called upon, and listening when others spoke, yet his attention was always partly on the princess. She moved through the proceedings with the same grace she had shown from the start, yet there was a subtle difference in her. Now her helmet remained absent from her head, a constant, quiet defiance that the alien council could not ignore. As the last agenda item drew to a close, the hall began to shift from formal posture to the softer current of post-meeting discussion. Delegates mingled in controlled clusters, some exchanging polite farewells, others engaging in quiet strategy. The human leader was engaged with two council members at the far end of the hall, leaving Daniel with a moment of stillness in the midst of the movement. He saw her then moving toward him with deliberate steps. Her guards followed, but kept a respectful distance, as if they understood this approach was not to be interrupted. She stopped before him, and for a brief moment, they simply regarded each other, her eyes searching his as though she was weighing the moment in her mind. She spoke softly, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone used to being heard. "I said I would ask you something before the day ended." Daniel nodded, his pulse steady but strong. He had felt the weight of this moment since she first spoke of it, and now that it had arrived, he knew that whatever question she carried, it would be one he could not answer lightly. She asked him if he would be willing to stand beside her, not just in this hall, not just for the days of this diplomatic mission, but as a bridge between their worlds. She explained that such a position would make him a target for those who feared change. It would bind him to her and to her people in a way that could not be undone. She made no attempt to soften the truth of the risks. He considered her words not with hesitation, born of fear, but with the knowledge that accepting would mean reshaping the path of his life entirely. He thought of the dreamlike familiarity in her eyes, the sense of inevitability that had followed him since their first meeting, and he understood that he could not walk away from this, even if he wished to. He told her that he would stand beside her, that he would face what came, not as an envoy bound by temporary orders, but as someone committed to the path she believed in. answer drew no outward display of surprise from her, yet he sensed that she had needed to hear it spoken aloud. She stepped closer so that her words reached only him. "Then it begins," she said, and in that moment, Daniel understood that this was not a choice for tomorrow or next year. It began now, with every watching eye in the hall marking the significance of their closeness. The alien officials exchanged tense glances, some whispering in hurried tones. Others stood silent, perhaps, already calculating how to adapt to what they had just witnessed. The human delegation also seemed to recognize the importance of the moment. Their leader watched from across the room, and though his expression was unreadable, he made no move to intervene. The two of them standing together was already a statement, one that could not be erased from the memory of this meeting. The princess raised her hand and placed it lightly against his chest, just over the steady rhythm of his heart. The gesture was small, yet in the traditions of her people, it was a public mark of alliance and trust. The hall grew quieter as those present recognized its meaning. Daniel felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders, yet it was not a burden he feared to carry. She lowered her hand slowly, but her gaze remained fixed on him, holding him in that unshakable calm that had drawn him from the start. With the formalities concluded, the delegations began to depart. Ships would leave the station within the hour, each carrying its own interpretation of what had happened in this hall. Some would see it as a dangerous break in protocol. Others would see it as the first real step toward peace. Daniel walked beside her as she made her way toward the exit, the silver of her hair catching the last light from the great ceiling above. Her guards formed a loose perimeter, but none came between them now. As they neared the doors, she spoke again in that quiet tone that seemed to carry farther than any raised voice. "Today they will speak of us in whispers. Tomorrow they will speak of us in arguments. One day they will speak of us as the reason the stars changed." Daniel understood then that her vision was not bound by the immediate struggles ahead. She was looking toward a future that neither of them might fully see, but which they could begin to shape at. The threshold, she paused, turning to face him once more. Crowd was behind them, the corridor ahead leading toward the docking bays and the waiting ships. She told him that their next meeting would not be in a hall or under the gaze of so many, but in a place where the stars themselves would be the only witnesses. He did not ask when or wherefore. He trusted that it would come as surely as this day. Had she inclined her head in a gesture that was both royal and personal, then turned and stepped through the doors. Her guards followed, and the sound of their footsteps faded into the hum of the station. Daniel remained for a moment, watching the space where she had been. The hall felt emptier without her presence, yet it also felt changed, as though her defiance, her beauty, and her quiet strength had left an imprint on the air itself. When he finally left to rejoin his own delegation, he knew that the mission had succeeded in ways that could never be written into official reports. The agreement signed that day would matter, but the true foundation for peace had been laid in the unspoken bond between two people from different worlds. Daniel carried that knowledge with him as he walked through the station corridors toward the human ship. Ahead lay uncertainty and danger, but also the possibility of something greater than either side had dared to imagine. As the doors to the docking bay opened and the stars spilled across his vision, he thought of her words and the weight they carried. He knew that whatever came next, he would be there when the future they had spoken of began to take shape. And somewhere beyond those stars, she would be waiting, just as she had been waiting for him long before either of them had known the other's name. The end.